Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, good day. I hope you're doing well. My name is Will Schmier, and welcome back to the first episode of the Lovable Survivor podcast. I just released episode 1. This is now the first official episode of the new podcast. That is the Lovable Survivor. And again, my name is Will Schmier. And I am a stroke survivor living with multiple sclerosis, which is hard to say when you have MS and you don't say it that often. I just, like I said, dropped episode 0, a little bit of an introduction. This one is going to be a little bit more in depth on my background, really to set the table and lay the foundation for this podcast. So you get to know a little bit more about who I am. I'm sure that will come out in every episode as a brain injury and stroke survivor. You know, there are tidbits that I forget sometimes, even with notes. And there are details that are missing sometimes. So yeah, I'm excited. This is a new direction for my podcasting. Previously, I did a show which is still archived on iTunes and Spotify, and I may bring it back at some point if we get off the rails too many times on this show. But this is, sorry, I had a little blip there. iPhones are trying to connect to the computer, and yeah. So again, this show is kind of a more focused continuation or sidetracking. Again, I did the Lovable podcast for 36 episodes. I learned a lot about what I want to do, what direction I want to go. It was great for getting into podcasting and kind of learning about the different things and the different niches. And, you know, again, the last 3 years since my stroke, I've learned quite a bit. And it's clear that I think I'm pretty good at a lot of things, but you know, there's just a lot that comes along with surviving a stroke, living with MS, having a family, being a father of 3, a husband. You know, not initially ever the direction I thought my life would go in, but that's, you know, kind of where I'm at. And I think there are lots of people that I can help. In fact, just last night, I was doing some research for the podcast, and this is going to be a podcast. It may at some point be a video podcast or have a video component to it. I may I really want to get into YouTube. I think it would be beneficial for stroke survivors just as much as this podcast. Some people prefer audio only. Some people prefer video. I think there's a room for both. What I think is great is that, for me, is that there are not a lot of stroke survivors with either a YouTube channel or a podcast. So I think I am a survivor who has a little bit of technical knowledge and can help other survivors. You know, and that's the goal, because what I read last night was an interesting stat that 1 of 4 people in the US, at least, will at some point probably have some variation of a stroke. It may not be a full-blown stroke. But yeah, that was surprising. And then even more surprising, I think, really caught me off guard, was that only 1 in 2 people, so 50% of people, only 50% of people ever receive treatment of any kind for a stroke, which is shocking. I got to be honest. It really caught me off guard last night. I did not realize I knew how fortunate I was personally, because I had health insurance. I had support from family, just, you know, trying to get me to where I needed to be. I was pretty adamant about getting help once I had the stroke. But yeah, anyways, this first episode is going to be a little bit of background, a lot of context, just again, setting the table. For those that don't know my story, you know, I'll fill in the details, like I said, as we go along. I'm going to try to give you the bullet points today. Long story short, I had a stroke in December 23rd of 2019. While in the hospital, I had been admitted for high blood pressure They actually found that I had AFib. I was supposed to have the AFib procedure where they shock your heart back into rhythm. Unfortunately, kind of in like a 2-day window from the time I got admitted to the time they were going to do that procedure, I had a stroke while in the hospital. It went undiagnosed initially. They thought I was too young. They thought it was impossible. My wife called it out. I kind of brushed it off. I think the doctors brushed it off. Long story short, had the stroke in the hospital. Unfortunately, I later found out that there are things that, they can do, but I think I was so big at the time, they could not safely determine if I had actually had the stroke. So they did not run some of the different procedures they can do to kind of curtail some of the issues. But yeah, I had the stroke. I went in to a facility here in Jacksonville, Florida, called Brooks Rehab, one of the best facilities in the country. Very lucky to have moved here a couple months before. Got in there, got to work pretty quickly. I was an inpatient for 30 days, January of 2020. Came home for about a week, watched the Super Bowl, woke up the next morning, talking funny, thought I had a second stroke. Turns out after another month in the hospital downtown, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, no family history, no background of having MS in the family. It's possible it was. They don't really know why or how it was brought about. But yeah, so now I am living with MS. I did go back to rehab a second time because I was left paralyzed on my right side from the stroke. When I went home, got diagnosed with MS. Was short-term paralyzed on the left-hand side, so I was a big hot mess the first quarter of 2020, and that's all before COVID. So yeah, I've been through some things. I am pretty well into my recovery. I think honestly, I've been saying I've been 85% for a long time. That might just be me thinking I can keep getting better and keep doing more to get better. And that's probably true. That's a lot of this podcast is about, the last 3 years and the steps I've taken to change my life, the things that I sort of wish I knew in the beginning, the road to recovery, rebuilding your life after a stroke. There are always new innovations coming along, new treatments. It's just really interesting. And I think, I basically am creating this because I felt really kind of alone in the beginning. I've had family support. Like I said, I have a wife and 3 kids. I have 2 sisters. My parents passed away, unfortunately, the year before my stroke. That's a whole other story that we could talk about at some point. I am an open book, but I'm trying to keep this pretty specific to stroke and things that can help. But yeah, I think that certainly played a part. I don't think it directly contributed to the stroke, but it's certainly the stress, I think, of losing my parents the way I did. It did not help. And again, I've talked about that at length on my other podcast, and I'm sure we'll talk about it here. But that is certainly a factor that played into things. So yeah, I was born, I guess we can kind of hop in now that you know that I have had a stroke. So I am a stroke survivor at 40 years old. I have 3 kids and a wife. And I also am living with MS. So yeah, let's go back to kind of the early days. Born in New York, raised in New Jersey. I also lived on Long Island briefly. So New York, New York City, Queens, Brooklyn, Long Island to New Jersey. Spent most of my youth in New Jersey, growing up there. Jersey gets a bad rap, but it's played a pivotal role in a lot of ways in my life. Sort of the chip on your shoulder, the fighting, from behind. There's a lot to it. But yeah, I have nothing but fond memories of growing up on the Jersey Shore. Across from Manhattan, went there a lot with my father who worked there, and my whole family, my mother, my sisters, because they both worked in New York. My mother was a financial analyst on Wall Street in the 80s. She then stayed home to raise us children. I think she started staying home once my youngest sister was born. So right around the 90s, my mom became a full-time stay-at-home mom at that point, did a lot of charitable stuff. Father worked in the city as an institutional trader. I think he probably did some other forms of trading throughout that time. I think he owned his own firm at one point. Unfortunately, they both passed. So I don't have the full details there, but yeah, he was worked on Wall Street, worked in the markets. Mother, again, was very early in the stock market for women. Definitely a glass ceiling situation. And yeah, so she played a big role and had a lot of influence on me and my family. And so did my father. Great people. Everybody who knew them loved them. I would say my dad was a little bit more the lovable one than my mother. My mother was very much like her parents, rough around the edges, tough as nails, but also, a heart of gold. Just a little more. She kept things a little closer to the vest. But yeah, she was an amazing woman. And yeah, I miss them deeply. So yeah, grew up in Jersey. I got a shiny brochure for the University of Miami when I was in high school. I applied there on a whim. I wound up getting a scholarship, which I took, and I said peace to New Jersey. Ironically, only person in the family without a super advanced degree, no graduate school. But I did go to school for architecture at Miami, a 5-year program, bachelor's, which is the equivalent of a master's. It just doesn't get the title. So there's that. Yeah, Miami is a great place, great school, great environment. I loved it. I have nothing but fond memories about Miami and going to school there. I think the world of the school and the programs, and I just learned a lot about myself and the world, and it was very different from Jersey. As you'll probably hear me say millions of times on this podcast, I'm very East Coast biased. I'm actually super East Coast. I don't even like going west of I-95, which for those that don't know, is sort of the main connector from the top of Maine all the way down the East Coast to Miami. And so, yeah, it just rides kind of the very East Coast. It depends on what state you're in and where, but it's pretty much a slice of the East Coast at the furthest east. It's, depending on what part or what state on the East Coast you're in, it's basically a 2-mile wide sliver of the entire East Coast. So I'm very biased. I have no problem saying it. It's just how I grew up. And yeah, I'm just a big fan of the East Coast. It's very densely populated. It's a lot of things, but it's kind of important to the story only because it is a big driver in my life. Yeah. And then so during college, I obviously, actually going back to high school, I got into sports, but I was also into Friends, and I took an active role in Friends because my sister went to high school with me. So I did very little in terms of homework in high school. I basically copied my sister most of high school, which got me the scholarship to college. And I joke about that now. It's obviously I did the work. I just didn't, homework wasn't my jam. So I spent a lot of time in social life. Had good friends, got into, I'm a millennial, so I think I was at the tail end of smoking cigarettes and heavy drinking. It was just kind of where we grew up. It was kind of the dawn of the internet, so it was around. And it was popular, and it was gaining traction, obviously. But I went to school in an area where, I guess I was kind of that last generation still too of really like riding bikes. And yeah, we were not behind computers. So the iPads didn't exist. So not all my friends even had computers at that time. So we were still very much, the group of friends getting into trouble, riding bikes around town, hanging out, doing stupid shit, that got into drinking and smoking, even though we were playing sports, led to, for me, it was my stroke happened at age 37. And before then, I had not come clean about it. But after my stroke, I came clean about a lot of things. And alcoholism was something that was a part of my life for a while. I don't think in the traditional sense. I was more of what I call a functional alcoholic. I did not do it to, I wasn't drinking to like hurt anybody. I was married with a child and we obviously had more children. Yeah, I was just one of those guys that liked drinking and I got into it a little too heavy. And then as I got older, I was like, oh, I'll just have a couple beers, and that turned into a couple more beers, and it really just spiraled out of control. But yeah, instead of figuring a way out of it, again, it wasn't like out of control. It didn't seem out of control. It didn't feel out of control at the time. Looking back, obviously it was, but it always seemed manageable. We had young kids, I took care of them with my wife. My kids are a little bit older now. Now I don't drink at all. The stroke pretty much wiped out the last time I had a cigarette or a beer was pre-stroke in 2019, and I have no desire to. I basically have retired from drinking and smoking. That's mildly funny, but yeah, I think once you have a stroke, you just realize those are not important things in your life anymore. And I was able to kind of step away from them completely without any issue. And for that, I'm very fortunate. I feel very grateful in that regard. I would rather just kind of quit those things in my life prior to them. I don't think they caused the stroke or the MS directly, but I certainly don't think they helped. In the last couple of years, I've really kind of taken a step back and looked at these things and gotten to the root of what I was doing. And, I've done a lot of physical therapy, but I've done a lot of emotional therapy, whether that's with therapists or kind of just on my own doing the work, because it can all be overwhelming when you have a stroke at any age, but especially when you're younger, it's very confusing, I think, because, you ask a lot of questions like, why me? Why at this age? A lot of the resources out there are not geared towards somebody who might be younger, who might be trying to get back on track with either their life or career. That's all been part of the interesting story. And again, these are things we'll talk about, but I've gone to entrepreneurship again. I've had some ups and downs there, but I feel like it works best for me with my schedule and with my recovery. It certainly would be easier to just collect a check, but I just, I was in a previous career that I didn't love. Again, I am sort of a elder millennial at this point, so I did go to University of Miami for architecture. I got into the field right after college. I worked in real estate and then went back to Miami a couple of years after I graduated to go work in architecture. Then the housing market crash happened. So it's been a lot of pivots. It's been interesting to navigate, which is funny because that's kind of the direction I've taken this podcast. It's like how to navigate a stroke recovery and brain injury, because obviously a stroke is a brain injury, but I think to kind of broaden it a little bit, this podcast is for anybody. You don't have to even be a brain injury survivor, but I think when you go through a brain injury, a major life event, there are certain things that people don't realize, whether it's the individual or the people around them, the caretakers, the family. Life is different. In most cases, neurological things you don't expect, things you don't think are part of the problem, or not problem, but just part of the event that you've had. It's just very different. I think one of the things that I struggle with for me personally, and I'm sure a lot of folks out there struggle with this, is that there are great doctors and physical therapists and speech therapists, and mostly everybody in the medical professions are very helpful. I've only had one or two very weird experiences with lots of doctor's appointments over the couple of years since my stroke. So yeah, the majority are insanely helpful, certainly wanting to help. They may not have the answers. They may not have been through it, so they don't exactly know, but they've seen a lot of things. And it's all helpful information, but sometimes you need just something a little different. And that, again, is kind of the purpose of this podcast. It's to share the things that I've gone through, the kind of the things that have worked for me, the things that I've dug into, because I think sometimes you just need a spark. For me, I just need some tough love sometimes. And like I said, it can be really tricky to kind of rebuild your life after a stroke, physically, mentally, emotionally, family, like you name it. It's a lot. And I think that's one of the hard things about stroke, especially if you're, what I would consider living kind of, I don't want to say easy breezy, but like, a life where you didn't have to think about things. Like once you had, like for me, when I had my stroke, I was paralyzed on the right side of my body. So I had to relearn to walk, to talk, to write. My handwriting is getting better, but it's just still not great. And it can be frustrating at times because, I remember exactly how things were right up until the day they weren't the same. And that is a big, big thing that I think gets overlooked by both doctors and individuals. It can take your time. I mean, it takes time to wrap your head around it. Think about it. I'm 3 years into my stroke recovery, and I'm just now starting the podcast and just now feel ready to share and talk with other survivors and share what I've learned the last 3 years. It's taken me a while. Last year was a big year for me. It was year 2, and I just knew that I could get further, but I just didn't know what to do or how to navigate and I'm still not sure I know how, but, I'm starting to ask those questions and get to that place where, there is good enough for certain things. And there's certain things that good enough isn't good enough for me. And I don't know how to get there, but I have to ask myself questions. I do a lot of experimenting with myself because I'm not a doctor. That's one of the other things is like, I don't want to say that I'm not a doctor a million times on this podcast. I mean, I'm going to say it probably a billion times, but I'm just sharing my advice. I'm just sharing what's worked for me, things that I wish I looked into sooner, things that, never crossed my mind. Like last year, breathing was a big thing. I learned how to properly breathe. I'm not doing a great job on this episode right now because I'm excited to talk. But I know if I slow down, take, deep breath is such a vague and unhelpful thing because that's a whole thing. We could do a separate episode on breathing, but in fact, I probably will at some point. But just a lot of things that I've learned for myself, and it's great for me. But like, I just want to share them. It serves no purpose for me to do all this work on myself and keep it to myself. If it doesn't work for you, I'm sorry, but I guarantee you something that I'm going to share will work for you. You can gain something from all these episodes of the podcast. I assure you, because I've gone through a lot. I'm insanely intense about it because, I'm kind of at that weird age where I'm not super young because there are certainly people that are in their teens and 20s, unfortunately, that have suffered a stroke. It seems like the majority are from accidents, but like anything else in life, anybody can have a stroke for any reason at any time. And it could be something, it could be a hole in the heart. It could be just a plethora of reasons. Not everybody is an alcoholic and out of shape and suffering from AFib and a former smoker. I mean, those don't help. And those are a lot of the things that were wrong with me. So it seems easy to point to my mistakes, but there are also tons of people that drink and smoke cigarettes and never have a stroke. So there's that too. And again, I have no family history of stroke in the family. to my knowledge, and none of MS. So it's kind of like, where did that come from? How did these things develop? And I'm sure there are things that I did not do that were helpful in those situations, but it's all really guessing at this point. And the truth is, part of this podcast, like I said, is about the recovery, how to navigate, how to think about things. If you want to go from good enough to unstoppable, you have to put in the work. It's not that simple, but it is that simple. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort, and it takes, I think looking back now, it's like, okay, I could have done this a little sooner. I wish I knew this. I wish somebody would have shared X, Y, and Z. Again, I had amazing therapists, amazing doctors. They gave me a ton of research, but a lot of the stuff out there is very medical, and it's very sort of grouped together. So what they say, if you're a survivor, you probably heard this a million times. Every stroke is different. That gets so fucking annoying. It's so old, so quick. However, it is absolutely true. And I think the disconnect is trying to figure out what things work for you. How do you figure out where to go first? For me, it was pretty clear. Stop drinking, stop smoking. Cool, done. That was done from day one. Listen to doctors, get all my kind of health things in order, at least get the information, then determine where I needed to go once I started getting these health things in order. Thanking whoever you believe in, whatever you believe in, just being very fortunate, lucky to be alive and survive. I was very grateful for that, And I think that, this kind of leads us into the next episode, where I'm going to talk about stroke specifically, and then just kind of any major life event dealing with the overwhelm. Because I think obviously it can be overwhelming. There are lots of things to figure out in the early days, and lots of people telling you lots of things. And I think, I don't know if I can be super helpful to your situation, but I think there are things that I can share that certainly can get you thinking in the very early days. If you're early in your recovery, honestly, things that, again, going back, are things I wish I knew sooner. Maybe even things that you had a stroke years ago, and maybe there are things that you haven't realized. So that's, there's that. And I think I love this format. I love the ability to help people. I do think I may go into video at some point, whether it's videos of this podcast when I record, or separate YouTube videos that could be helpful. It really depends on where things go. But again, that is kind of, we're wrapping up episode 1 here. That gives you a good amount of background on me. I'm an open book, happy to answer questions. I'm sure a lot of things I've said today will come up again, and I will give more details as they're necessary or asked about or required. You can definitely give me a follow on Twitter. Twitter, LinkedIn are probably the 2 biggest platforms for me. We'll see. I'm going to try to get back into TikTok at some point. Want to get into YouTube. And I think we're just about wrapped up for episode 1, and the kind of background foundational things. And we'll talk about a lot more. I'm sure you'll hear my kids in the background. You'll hear my wife in the background. And we'll be on this journey together. And, if you've just kind of had an event, I know it sounds easier said than done, but hopefully you're able to get the help you need, and just, take it one day at a time. That's the best advice I can give to anybody. It is a process. People say annoying stuff, but over time you start to realize, okay, that's good, but I need to focus on things that work for me and for you. And if it works for me, it may work for you. But that's all kind of the context. And and the other, I guess the last thing I'll say is, it's all hard, but just so you know, if you listen to this far, I appreciate it. And, I'm basically a big, giant scientific experiment for myself. one of my companies that I'm trying to open up and build here is a community for survivors, because I found there are not many good ones. There are message boards and things like that, but Survivor Science is going to be sort of the hub, and this podcast of where ideas and conversations happen, and we'll build it out as this progresses. But yeah, the goal is to help other folks who have been through a major life event, a stroke, TBI, anything related to the brain. There are survivor is a broad word, and there are lots of things people survive, but I think it is sort of brain injury survivor, neurological events, major life events that really, cause setbacks, and how do you overcome those? And again, how do you navigate those? There is no playbook for this stuff, so I look forward to